All right, so we're taking a deep dive into this whole Trump trade thing today.
Okay.
And it's interesting, right? Because it's more than just a catchy headline.
Yeah.
It's like Wall Street's got this buzz about how a potential second Trump term
Right.
could really shake things up in the market.
Exactly.
So we've got a couple of articles we're looking at today from CBS News and Moomoo.
Okay.
And then on top of that, we've got some analysis on like how Trump's economic policies might actually play out in the real world.
Yeah.
You ready to try to make some sense of all this?
Absolutely. And I think the important thing to remember here is with Trump trade, we're not really taking sides.
Right.
It's more about looking at the potential impacts of these policies
Yeah.
on the market. Right. Not about whether we agree or disagree with it.
Right. It's about what their actual effect is going to be.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's talk about that CBS News article for a second,
Sure.
because they're saying that investors are already starting to make moves
I know, right?
based on this potential Trump win.
It's
like the entire market has become this giant prediction game.
It really has. And I think that's what Anatol Koletsky was saying,
Yeah.
co-founder of Gavekal. He was quoted in the CBS article.
Right.
And his point was that the closer we get to this election, the more volatile things are going to be.
Yeah.
Because the outcome is uncertain, right?
Right.
Which means there's more potential for like big wins, but also big losses.
Yeah. It's a high stakes game for sure.
Sure.
So, okay, uncertainty, that seems to be the name of the game here.
Definitely.
But if we're trying to kind of break down this whole Trump trade playbook,
Yeah.
what are some of the key areas that investors are looking at? Like, what are the things that could really shift the market?
Yeah. Great question.
So it seems like some of the big themes that keep coming up are like tax cuts,
Right.
tariffs, energy,
Mm-hmm.
deregulation.
Yeah. All the classics.
Yeah, it's like the greatest hits of things that can move the market.
Definitely. And I think what's interesting is with each one of those, you have the potential for both winners and losers.
Right.
Like take tax cuts, for example.
Okay.
Our analysis suggests that a second Trump administration might try to like extend or even expand the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act from 2017.
Oh, yeah, that's the one that was supposed to pay for itself, right?
Exactly. And while tax cuts can be good in the short term,
Right.
they can boost corporate profits,
Right.
put more money in people's pockets.
Sure.
They can also lead to a bigger deficit,
Right.
and that can translate to higher interest rates down the road.
Yeah, which is not so good for the market.
Not so good for the market.
No, not when you're looking long term anyway.
Exactly.
Okay, so tax cuts, a little bit of a mixed bag maybe,
A little bit.
depending on your time horizon.
Exactly.
CBS News also mentioned tariffs,
Yes.
particularly on China.
Right.
And I kind of remember those actually hurting U.S. manufacturing a while back.
Yeah, they did.
So is that something that we should be worried about again?
It's tough to say because on the one hand, tariffs are meant to protect domestic industries, right?
Okay.
But they can also mess with global supply chains,
Right.
which then raises prices for consumers.
Makes sense.
And then ultimately that can slow down economic growth.
So it's kind of a trade-off then.
It is a trade-off.
Okay, so what about immigration? Because our sources are kind of hinting that a second Trump administration might mean stricter policies there.
Yeah, and that's another area where the market impact is a little bit complicated.
How so?
Well, on the one hand, if you have fewer workers coming in, that could mean higher wages for the people who are already here.
Okay, so that's good for workers.
Potentially, but it also might lead to companies raising prices even more.
Oh, I see.
And then you have inflation, and that can hurt consumer spending.
Right. It's like this balancing act.
It is. It's all connected.
So where does energy fit into all of this? Because I remember our research mentioning something about Trump's support for domestic oil and gas.
Yeah, so that could definitely benefit those big energy companies. Like who...
Like ExxonMobil? They'd probably do pretty well, at least in the short term.
Oh, okay. Short term.
Right, because in the long term, you have to think about the global shift to renewable energy.
Yeah, it's true.
If we're still really reliant on oil and gas, will that slow down investments in things like solar and wind?
Right. Because a lot of companies are putting money into those areas now.
Exactly.
Sure.
So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
So again, it's like this weird push and pull between short-term gains and then what happens 5-10 years down the line.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes the Trump trade so fascinating.
Yeah.
It's not as simple as just saying, okay, this guy likes this industry, so it's going to go up.
Right.
You have to think about all these different factors and how they might interact with each other.
So you're saying don't bet everything on one horse.
Exactly. Diversify, do your research.
Okay, so we've talked about some of the traditional sectors like energy, manufacturing,
Mm-hmm.
but I know our listener is super interested in crypto.
Of course, who isn't these days? Especially Bitcoin, and how that might be affected by all of this.
Yeah, let's dive into that.
So we've talked about some of the traditional sectors,
Mm.
like energy manufacturing,
Mm-hmm.
but I know our listener is super interested in crypto,
Of course, who isn't these days?
especially Bitcoin, and how that might be affected by all of this.
Yeah, let's dive into that.
So what's the connection between Bitcoin and a potential second Trump term?
Well, it's interesting because if you remember that CBS News article they mentioned, Trump's been making some positive noises about crypto lately.
Oh, yeah, he has, hasn't he?
And of course, his running mate is very much pro-crypto.
Right, right.
So if they win and the administration really embraces digital currency,
Yeah,
that could be huge for investors in that space.
especially Bitcoin, right? Because that's the one everyone thinks of.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
it's not just about like sentiment or hype.
Okay.
Remember how we were talking about inflation earlier?
Right, with the tax cuts and everything.
Exactly. Well, Bitcoin is often seen as a hedge against inflation.
Because it's like digital gold or something.
That's the idea. There's a limited supply no matter what happens with the Fed.
Right.
There will only ever be 21 million Bitcoins.
So if inflation goes up because the dollar gets weaker,
Right.
then Bitcoin starts to look more and more appealing.
A lot of investors, yeah.
It's like a safe haven.
Exactly.
Okay, so to wrap things up then, for someone who's listening to this and thinking, okay, Trump frayed, time to adjust my 401k, what's the most important thing to keep in mind?
I'd say don't just blindly follow the hype.
Right.
Don't just bet on whatever Trump happens to mention in a speech.
Okay.
It's about understanding the bigger picture, like how his policies might actually change things.
Yeah.
Tax policies, trade, energy, even crypto regulations, those could all be affected.
So you're saying do your research, don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Exactly. Diversification is key. And remember, this is a long game.
Right.
The market might react to news in the short term, but real growth that takes time.
Yeah. Patience is key.
Absolutely.
This has been awesome. Thanks for breaking it all down with us.
My pleasure. Anytime.
And to our listeners out there, keep those questions coming because that's what the deep dive is all about. Until next time, happy investing.